What diet is recommended for an addict early in recovery?
Yeah. So I would say, so I think like the folate discussion is really good because it gets to the discussion of gut microbiota. And we have found, again, in nutritional psychiatry that the gut is a huge driver of mental health.
What diet is recommended for an addict early in recovery?
Yeah. So I would say, for the Meadows Fuel Well program, our goal is really patients, visitors, and guests. Even though it was something I thought of, I'll tell you, they had an amazing team that I worked with, including their chefs, to be able to come up with how it actually is implemented. But I think when you look at what are kind of like the top foods that we know are associated in the field of nutritional psychiatry in relation to helping with addictive disorders, trauma, things like that. We really have to go more clinical and go back to the brain. So when we look at things like depression, for example, we know that there's inflammatory factors associated with depression. And so if we can reduce inflammation, as we have seen in multiple studies, we can help with some of those factors, and that can help with depression as well, amongst other things. So what are some of the biggies? I think getting more omega-3 fatty acids are really critical. Those are one of the main things that we've seen in terms of mental health outcomes and some of the trials that we've seen. So if someone is like, oh, I hate fish, that's not happening, then we can look at omega-3 supplementation. But I do think the marine base is really critical. So looking at EPA and DHA, which is what a salmon has within it, right? As opposed to ALA. ALA is still great, alpha linoleic acid in the plants, walnuts, chia seed, things like that. But if I were to say, okay, here's my pie in the sky, I would go the marine base. So I think that's really critical. I think folate and vitamin D. Yeah, go ahead.
Hold on. On that note, so you said salmon. What about other fish? Does it matter? Is salmon the best? What about halibut? What about mackerel? What about trout?
Yeah.
What about tuna?
Yeah. So they're all great. But let's just say that number one, you want to find fish that has low mercury. So how is mercury determined in a fish? The age and the size. Tuna is huge. And it's got a lot of surface area. So the more surface area you have on a fish, the more likely they can absorb more mercury, which is why tuna is a high mercury food, despite the fact that it also has omega-3 fatty acids. The reason why things like sardines are so fabulous is because they're so tiny. You're going to get virtually no mercury. Right? Okay. So there's that component, and it has omega-3 fatty acids. So I think from the omega-3 perspective, wild salmon, lake trout, small amounts of tuna, right? Those are fine. Those are all really great options to think about. Sardines. A lot of people don't like sardines, but sardines are another great option. And then when you're thinking of omega-3s, let's say, okay, if we get out of the fish world, which is obviously the marine base, then we go back into that plant world. So walnuts, chia seed, flaxseed, things like that. If you look at the general dietary guidelines, the recommendation is probably about at least 2 servings of fatty fish a week. And a serving is probably like your fist, right? That's what a serving pretty much looks like. I think the most important components are low mercury and wild. So if you can get, if the thought process is, well, I really want the wild salmon, but I can't afford it because when it's fresh, it's really expensive, then maybe you look at a canned version and determine, well, how do I utilize canned salmon within my diet?
To get a free copy of the 12-step guide that I created for you, click on the link in the description below. Now, speaking to mercury, let's say someone eats a can of tuna every single day. Like what potentially could happen with high amounts of mercury?
Yeah, you can definitely get mercury toxicity. There's no doubt about that. So, I've seen that probably not a huge amount of my patients, but I am in integrative medicine. So we do tend to see patients that are more likely to have things like heavy metal toxicity. Mercury would be one of them. And if you have too much mercury, of course, like that could affect your brain, and that affects basically everything else, right? So I think that that's just something to think about. I once had this patient, this is so interesting, but it speaks to the mercury, just couldn't figure out what was going on with this person's symptoms, right? And we were thinking mercury because of the fact that it just went along with what we knew in the literature related to mercury toxicity and behavior. But this guy had like no mercury in his diet. So what we later discovered was that he's a huge fisherman, constantly had the hook in his mouth while he was doing everything else to get the line, and he was fishing daily. So the mercury was there. We were right, but it wasn't coming from diets. So the thing is that like sometimes you have to really go and look at, okay, like we really need an integrative or functional. I'm not a functional dietitian, I'm integrative, but a functional approach would also be warranted for things like that to kind of determine, okay, am I having too much? So we've definitely seen, I mean, I don't know if you remember, but I think it was Jeremy Piven, I think. He was public about this. He had like this huge sushi habit. And then he was like, oh my gosh, like I found out that I have mercury toxicity. So I think with tuna, I think probably 2 servings a week is probably fine if you're pregnant, less than that. But I think we can take that discussion of tuna and really relate it to other places. Like getting too much of anything is probably not a great idea, right? Like let's eat real food and let's eat small amounts of it. Folate's going to be found in leafy greens. It's also going to be found in beans and legumes. So I think like the folate discussion is really good because it gets to the discussion of gut microbiota. And we have found, again, in nutritional psychiatry that the gut is a huge driver of mental health. So if we have good gut microbiota, which we know is determined by what we call microbial diversity, we're more likely to have better outcomes with mental health. So leafy greens are great for guts. Beans and legumes are great for gut because of the fact that it's got fiber. So having a higher fiber diet is really impactful.
If you got value from this video, if you heard what you needed to hear, be sure to like it. Comment if you've got a question or you have something to say. Subscribe to the channel. Camelback Recovery provides treatment services for people struggling with mental health, mental illness, addiction, alcoholism, whatever it may be. So if you or a loved one is struggling and you need some guidance and you need some direction, reach out to us. Our contact information is down below, or you can go to our website, camelbackrecovery.com, whether it be detox, inpatient treatment, outpatient treatment, sober living, recovery coaching, sober companion services, whatever it may be. Like I said, we can either help you or make sure that you get sent in the right direction. We help people all over the country, all over the world for that matter. I'll see you on the next video.